All right, my friends. So, what we're gonna do today, and I guess rounding out this section and this chapter, is going to be talking about this, continuing our discussion on reverberation or reverb or verb. What we want to look at last time, we looked at how to kind of model and create, and we talked about growth sound in a room, and then we want to be able to model and model how the room's going to sound, and look at absorption coefficients and Sabine's formula. Also, speaking of that, so there's some. I didn't actually mention this last time. On Sabine's formula, there is some example calculations at the end of the chapter as well. They kind of go through in a little bit deeper analysis than what I did in class last time. So it's worth reading and looking through it. So, but what we're going to look at today, though, is on our reverb discussion is how we measure it and how we analyze it. This is the stuff that I think. I think is like, well, I guess it's pretty important stuff, because this is going to lead you to like in your quest for becoming an acoustician, or just making your band or rehearsal space or your concert hall or your home theater or any of those kind of spaces sound really good. So you like typically what the way my process works is I'll go through and I'll model it as much as I can using Sabine's formula if it warrants it. And then I'm going to go through, and then I also do stuff like room mode analysis, which we're going to get to that like in a I don't know, coming up in a couple weeks probably. Doing some room mode analysis, and we'll also see that with Room EQ Wizard. There's some more of that involved there. And then I go through and we'll measure a room, and then I analyze a room. And what we'll find though is that measuring a room is actually pretty easy. It's like it's not that tricky. I mean, it takes a couple times to get the hang of it and get the hang of the software, but it's analyzing it that's the really tricky part. So we're going to get into a little bit of this right now, but we're going to get further into it as we go throughout the rest of the semester, because that's the really tricky part. If you spend some time on the Room EQ Wizard forums, you'll see people that are like that take lots of people take their measurements, and that's the easy part. The hard part is going, what do I do with this information? So that's what we're trying to demystify. Actually, that's kind of like the underlying theme of this entire course. So anyway, we're going to measure reverb, analyze reverb, look at the reverb characteristics, look at acoustic coupled spaces, and optimum reverb times, and artificial reverb. So I think actually the acoustic coupled spaces, we might actually not talk about that too much, but we'll see if we have time. We'll see where we get to it with that. So, okay, let's talk about how to measure reverb. So I've kind of alluded to it a few times already in some of our earlier discussions, but there's a few different ways we can do this. So what we want to do is like when we again use this use this term we would call something like room tuning. So we can't actually tune a room because a room doesn't actually make any sound itself. So to make a room make sound, or to tune a room, what we need to do is we need to add energy into the room and listen to what comes afterwards. So what the effects are, how, like when I add sound energy into a room and then I remove that energy, what happens to the energy as it bounces around in the room, as it decays, as it reflects, as it diffuses, as it absorbs, and all these kind of things. Like we can use that as a kind of our tool. And so when we talk about room ring out, that's what we're doing right there. So essentially what we're going to do here, yeah. So I'm going to psych the room with energy, with sound energy, remove the energy source, and record it, analyzing the resulting decay. This can tell us like how the room feels and how it issues. So we'll talk about the steady state or impulses method right here. There's a few different ways we can pull this off, but in essence, at its core, what we're doing is we're adding energy into the room, we're taking the energy away and listening to what's left, and as it decays, and everything from Sabine's formula, which shows us like the time and the characteristic of it, and surfaces and absorption materials, all that kind of stuff play into this. All right, so let's talk about it. So if we do the steady state method, we talked about this notion of steady state in last class, where if I turn on a speaker and I add energy into the room and just bring it up, the energy is going to fill the room. Like the energy is gonna fill the room, but it's gonna hit a steady state where the energy being dissipated the energy is being dissipated at the same rate as being added to the room. So that can come from me yelling at my voice, or it can come from speakers, or it can come from like a piano or something like that, where basically I add some sort of continuous sound source. It adds energy to the room, and then it stays there, and it doesn't get any louder as the energy fills. Like kind of like the rate at which it dissipates is the term, but we could say leaks out or goes away is the same rate at which it's being recorded. So what we're going to do in the steady state method here, and we alluded to this last time when we were looking at essentially like the measurement of reverb time, is that when we're talking about RT60 in the beginning, basically we're going to add energy into the room and say we bring it up to say 100 decibels or something like that, 80 decibels, 85 decibels, doesn't matter really. But what we do is we'll use 100 decibels because it's a easy, clean number. We'll bring it up, and the speakers are blasting out 100 dB. Then what I do is I turn it off and I start my stopwatch, or I can start my stopwatch before and basically just say, as soon as I stop, when I stop the sound, that's when I want to listen to what's left in the room. And like, that's the kind of the time one versus minus time two, or sorry, time two minus time one, to get that like differential. But then what we do is, what we want to do is like stop the energy, stop the noise and record the energy decay. So it's not really used, this method isn't really used that much in real life. I just don't know anybody that does this. We will see some stuff like if you're using like a real-time analyzer, if you work say in live sound, and you will use like blasting pink noise to tune the speakers and the room itself, but you're not really looking at reverb characteristics. You're usually looking at more like the speaker performance and the loud, like the EQ and performance of the loudspeaker. You don't usually look at reverb with that method, but some people can do it, and it's been done for a long time. It was definitely an improvement over like traditional old school analog methods, but we've gotten better with it since then. So we'll talk about the swept ones here. So let's talk about the impulse method. So this is the way that things are done most of the time these days. So energy from transient source is used. So it's an impulse. An impulse is a single burst with all frequencies. And the traditionally it's been something like balloon pops. Like that's been like the I guess the tool for a long time, and it's still used. It's actually pretty good. Like you can do quite a bit with it. Like even with a humble, like in fact I just happen to have this sitting right here. So with my trusty field recorder, my Tascam DR40, and a bag of balloons, I can walk into a room and I can just do a balloon pop with this, and I can capture that impulse as that and listen to that energy decay. Not only that, I can use that, bring it into Room EQ Wizard and analyze it, but I can also just drop that into say something like a convolution reverb, and I can use that reverb characteristic. So impulses are pretty neat. You can use them for a lot of different things. So let's talk about it a little bit more here. So other things like starter pistols are a great one. So what we're trying to do here, we're just trying to add a lot of energy. So a balloon pop, like if you think about, like I sat in on some of these talks at AES, and it's about like the balloon pop method, where what you want to do, if you're going to try and do a balloon pop, you find a fairly good sized balloon, you blow it up as tight as possible, like to the point where you think it's going to blow your face off. Because the tighter you blow up a balloon, when you pop it, the goal is that you want to have the shards, you want to have as many shards as you can with a balloon, because that will show that the energy is expanding in a spherical pattern. Obviously, I'm going to be in the way of the thing, so even though it's expanding in a spherical manner, I'm going to be including a little bit of it, but that's just the way it goes. You could come up with some sort of sophisticated remote thing where a tack hits a balloon across the room or something like that, or maybe throw a dart at a balloon across the way. But it's but I think that's overkill for something like that. But and then there's also that like, I won't say it's a joke, but like somebody commented on class a little bit ago, but like that red balloons are the best ones to do. So there's kind of this industry inside information that red balloons are the ones you use for acoustic pops, and the reason supposedly is that the dye in the red makes it such that it breaks in such a way that's beneficial to these measurements. They talked about it in that talk I was in, but I didn't really like lock into like the true meaning of it. It's kind of more like a nudge nudge wink wink kind of thing. But what we're looking for here, and so what happens is when this pulse of the balloon expands, an impulse is just a burst of energy, and a burst of energy is technically it's all the frequencies at the same time. So this burst of energy, this compression, actually creates what's called an N wave. It creates compression and then it overshoots and comes back, and it creates like this, like a compression wave that goes out, and right behind it creates a rarefaction wave before it corrects itself. So we call that like an N wave. And so that wave is that compression wave travels out, and it hits the different surfaces and starts to bounce around. And as it does that, certain frequencies are going to be absorbed into the material. Some are transmitted and some are reflected. And as a result, when we record this, we can analyze it and say what comes afterwards. And based off of the size of the room, the surface area of the room, and the absorbent materials, just like in Sabine's equation, that's going to affect the reverb tail, or like affect just the reverb, how long it goes for, and what the frequency response of those reflections are going to be. So this has been a way that's been done for a long time, and I still use this. But even sometimes I'll just go into like a room and I'll just clap. Just like it's not a very good impulse, but it does work. And so if I just basically clap my hands, I can disregard the clap with my ears, and I can hear what's happening with the reverb tail. And it's just one of these like little things. Like my room in here is super dead, but when you walk into any other kind of like classroom or parking garage or stairwell or performance hall or anything like that, just clapping will give you a sense. After you do it for a while, you start to lock in and you understand what the reverb tail sounds like, and you go like, oh yeah, it's a warm long reverb, or it's a bright short reverb, or something along those lines. Yeah, so this is basically a simple recorder with a recorder and a sound source, and yeah, so that's really, you can use any kind of recorder, like something like this would work just fine. The trick is though, like it's really hard to use these because you're trying to track. If you're doing this, you want to use, of course, 24-bit, and actually doing something like 96 kilohertz is always a good idea. You want to go really high resolution because you're almost always going to clip on these things, and it's really tough to not clip. So, but it's a lot of fun. And so I like the talk I went to that talk I keep referring to at AES. They were talking about like it was these Stanford professors that went to a bunch of these huge churches in Europe that are like museums now. And they're like, hey, can we get some impulse samples of these spaces, both for reverb analysis and also to use as like reverbs as convolution reverb. And the museum's like, nope, you can't do that. So what they would do is they would just sneak in right before closing, and they would bring in their field recorders and pop balloons, and they would pop and then run, try to get away from the security people. So it's just funny to think about that, but it works really well. And like depending on how motivated I am, I will actually carry around this field recorder and some balloons in my backpack. And if you stumble upon a really cool space, you're like, wow, this place is kind of neat sounding, I might as well like grab it. Because you can use that as a convolution reverb. Like it's that simple. Like literally, you pop a balloon and you just like bring it in your DAW, chop off the beginning of it, and then you can bring it into like Ableton has the Convolution Reverb Pro. You can do it in Space Designer with if you're in Logic. Of course, with Pro Tools, it's not free, so you have to like get Waves, or like Waves IRL, I think is what it is what's called. Or if you're in Cubase or Nuendo, it's called Reverence. And there's a few of them out there. There's a lot of convolution reverbs out there, but it's just simple. You can literally just drag that impulse in, and then all of a sudden you have the reverb as if you were playing in that space. It's pretty cool. So I really encourage you to try this out. We're going to talk more about this in critical listening next semester, but it's like, if you want to get into the convolution stuff, it's really fun. So that's kind of like the classic way of doing it. The more modern way is doing is what's called the swept sine. So what we do is we take, and this is kind of crazy. What we do is we sweep a sine through a frequency range. Typically, we'll say 20 to 20,000 hertz, and we record that, and what it records just a wheat. And what we're going to do is we do what's called actually in this case we're convolving it. So we're going to convolve it. What we do is we take that entire sweep. It's kind of this math magic transform process. We take this sweep and we squish that sweep all to time zero. And so therefore we end up with an impulse. Essentially, it's the equivalent of an impulse, but that impulse was done over time, but then we squish that time back to time, and so that all that impulse happens at one single particular time in time, at one particular point in time, and then we can hear and analyze the reverb. And the cool thing is with this is, we created an impulse from the swept sine. It's like, I don't really want to go into the math behind it, but it's pretty neat. It's a pretty cool process. So this is the most common modern method that we use. And the reason, because it gets a fantastic signal to noise. So if I do a balloon pop, and I'm like, say I have a balloon pop, and this happens when I do it in class sometimes. If I'm doing that, somebody inevitably go, oh, because you can't help it. When a balloon pops and it's super loud, it wakes you up big time, and it usually startles you. And sometimes you can't help but yelping. The problem is when I get that little yelp in there, that shows up in my analysis. And so I'm like, oh man, I've got this person talking, or maybe there's an HVAC system, like an air conditioning system, or something along those lines that's happening at the same time that I'm doing this. Well, that when I talk about that, what I'm saying is the signal to noise. So the signal being, I want to listen to my reverb tail, but the noise being the interfering noise from other things in the room. And one could argue that those are part of the acoustic analysis. And yes, they are part of the acoustic analysis, but not part of the reverberation analysis. So the cool thing about the swept sine method, it's kind of hard to describe it, but basically what it's doing is it's tracking a particular frequency at only one particular frequency at a particular time. So the cool thing is it can disregard a lot of the other noises that are happening in the room at any particular time. So it does a really good job of getting rid of other stuff. And so this is the preferred method. But the problem is both with the balloon and with the swept sine method is that if you're using a sound source that's nonlinear, meaning it's not a perfect impulse. The balloon's a pretty good one, but when we do a swept sine, you're going to be at the mercy of whatever your speaker can put out. So if your speaker's not very linear, or if it can't go very low in frequency, you're not going to get very good low frequency resolution. But to be honest, at the low frequencies, it's not usually the reverb that's going to be the issue. It's going to be room modes and other like HVAC systems and that sort of stuff that happens at the low frequency analysis stuff. So, well, we're actually going to do a sweep here and take a look at it here in just a couple minutes. So, okay, yeah, actually, let's do it now. So let me just let's set this up here, and then I'll go do a room. Actually, I'll go do the a sweep in the other room so you can see how it's done. And it's kind of a quick one, but you'll see how it's done. So that if you want to start doing this on your own, which I strongly encourage you to do it in your studio, do it in your living room, do it all over the place. Just try and figure out like how to do these sweeps, and it's pretty rad. So here's how this is going to go down. So what we need here is a measurement mic, which where is my measurement mic? That's okay. I'll bring it back here in a minute. So I have all my stuff sitting in another room. I guess I didn't leave it in here. My bad. So we need a measurement mic. So we've talked a little bit about measurement mics during the review for the midterm, but a measurement mic so it can be really cheap to really expensive. So all you need to look up is just Google measurement mic. Go to Sweetwater and find it. You can go to Amazon, or Dayton Audio. Well, the Dayton Audio one is actually sold by Parts Express. It's they're all good, and so I would say like what's the difference between a good or I would say good, but we'll say what's the difference between say a $60 mic and a $500 mic? Well, usually when you make microphones with super small diaphragms, the electronics to make super high sensitivity signal to noise microphones is the analog circuitry is really tricky to pull that off. So really what you're paying for is like the noise floor level on a microphone. So if you have a cheaper microphone, it's not going to do very well at lower to moderate levels, like sound levels. Whereas a really expensive mic is usually going to have much better signal noise ratio. So it's going to basically be able to record at much lower levels and be flat, and also likely be flatter. Most microphones are going to come with a calibration curve. So if you're buying a really cheap one, they won't have that. But if you're buying a more expensive microphone, what they do is they know that this microphone isn't going to be completely linear. So what they can do is they'll send you a USB key, or sometimes you can look them up online, depending on, you look at your serial number of your microphone, and they individually sweep these using some special equipment, and they know the exact response of that microphone. So therefore, if for whatever reason it has a bump at say 3 kilohertz, like maybe a 2 dB bump at 3 kilohertz. Now 2 dB doesn't sound like a lot for most normal like music situations, but when you're trying to do an acoustic analysis, you want that thing to be pretty stinking flat. So what you can do is you can get a calibration curve, and what that does is that basically in math, after you do the sweep, it basically compensates for any of the non-linearities of the microphone. So, and then also things like the more expensive microphones are going to go up to a broader, higher frequency. So like I have like the Earthworks M30. So the Earthworks M30, the 30 correlates to that. It goes up to 30 kilohertz, totally flat. Whereas most measurement microphones are going to go up to about 20 kilohertz. Does 30 kilohertz matter? Not really. They also make the M50, which goes up to 50 kilohertz. So those are good to see if you're getting some weird, like super high frequency stuff, but really not for like normal acoustic analysis. Do you need something that high? So I would say, and then so my go-tos, I use the Audix TM1. So that's a $300 mic. I have one of those. Actually, I have a couple of those, and those are my field ones. I bring those out into the field because I mean $300 is still expensive, but it's not nearly as expensive as my like $700 Earthworks M30. So I don't bring my M30 out into the field. I use that one for like speaker measurement at home. But then I also have I think I have the Dayton EMM6 USB. So it's a USB version of that microphone. It's okay. I think I got it for I can't remember what I got it for. But it's like you can get the USB version of it, but the problem is it doesn't have gain control, and so you don't need a mic. You don't need a mic pre for it, which is cool, but you can't control the gain on it, and it's got pretty low gain on it, so you have to like really have a loud sound source for this thing to work. But I have had the Behringer one in the past, and I've used the Dayton one in the past too, and those are really good budget ones, but they're solid for what they are, and especially for the price, you can just bring them everywhere. So you're also going to need an audio interface. So like an inexpensive 2-channel USB is more than adequate. So I use my like go-to that I carry around. I don't have it in my backpack right now, but I carry it around. Is the Focusrite Scarlett 2 i2. That's a great one. It's like, I don't know, like $150 or something like that these days. $160. But any kind of like 2-channel pro audio interface will work. That has phantom power will work. That'd be solid. So when you're explaining this to people who are like home theater enthusiasts, this is like a tougher sell, but everybody here understands what I mean by that kind of stuff. And you're gonna need a speaker. So flat frequency response is best, but use what you have. So in my case, I have some old studio monitors, some active studio monitors that I'll bring around. They're the old event, the 8-inch ones that I can't remember what they're called. The model of them are. They're actually not that flat, but they serve their purpose for what we're looking for here. So and it's just nice to have an active speaker. But if you have like an active like Mackie PA speaker or something like that, those will work. They're not very flat, but they'll work. They're not very linear in terms of frequency response, but they'll do the job. And then some software. So RumiQ Wizard is great, but there's other stuff out there. There's things like it's called Clio, which is like an Italian group that makes this stuff. It's really expensive. I've used a thing called Arda, which is written by I think a Czech professor. It's Windows only, and it's pretty cool. It's what I used to use before RumiQ Wizard was out and around. And then what else is out there right now? Then I think there's also stuff like you'll see stuff like Smart with two A's, SMART. That's one that's used a lot in like for setups of like for PA systems. It's good, but I would say it's not really what we're looking for this one. I have to say though, for what it is, RumiQ Wizard just kicks some serious butt. It's been around for a long time. It's written by this one dude, and it's amazing software. Like it's worth like $2,000 for this software. It's that good. It's amazing that it's free. So the setup looks something like this. So we take our microphone, and of course this is just a regular microphone right here. But oh yeah, and I would say like, the question sometimes comes up: do you really need a measurement microphone? Can you use like a SM58 or something like that? The answer is you shouldn't. If you're doing acoustic analysis, you should be using a measurement microphone, and the reason being is that it needs to be omnidirectional. So, but the problem is if you use something like you're like, well, maybe I have like a Rode NT2 that's like a omnidirectional mic, and that's great, but it's the large diaphragms are fairly nonlinear. In fact, I mean, most large diaphragms are kind of somewhat pre-tuned to match the human voice and things that will sound good when recorded. So that's why we choose different microphones for different reasons, because they have like a different quality of sound that we like. We can tune our microphones to our recording source. But when you're doing measurements, you want those to be dead flat. And so Earthworks sells, they sell their microphones to be used in recording studios, but I've tried recording with my Earthworks and it sounds awful. It sounds so bad. It's so thin and just weird. It just doesn't sound right. So I don't use that for actually recording, even though it's dead flat. So that kind of shows that there's like this weird disconnect between microphones that we use for like music recording and dialogue and sound effects versus what we use for like measurement. But the important thing is that it's an omnidirectional microphone, so it can be pointed in any direction. And that's why they have that slender shape, because of diffraction. So, because basically we want that super small diaphragm to be able to pick up all frequencies omnidirectionally. So not even low frequencies, high frequencies. So if you remember that high frequency I need my diaphragm to be about that big if I want the frequency of 20,000 hertz to be able to diffract around it so that it behaves omnidirectionally. So, but I just here in this diagram, I just showed a basic like microphone. So I have my laptop hooked up to my audio interface. I use a Scarlett 2i2. This is my input and my output, of course, phantom power. And yeah, so then this is what does the sweep, and then this is what measures the room. So we're going to do a swept sine from 20,000 hertz, take lots of measurements around the space, and make sure to take good notes. I remember like hanging out with one of my acoustician friends, and he would walk into this room, and he would do a sweep. He'd go, "Woot!" Be like, "All right, we got it. Let's go." I was like, "Are you nuts?" Why? It literally takes like 5 seconds. It takes like 15 minutes to set up, but it takes like 5 seconds to do a sweep. Like, dude, it doesn't cost you anything but like maybe a megabyte of data. So why don't you take like 20 different measurements around the space, and so you can see what changes as I move around the space, and that's really revealing. And so you can see what's changing, and that'll give you a good sense of how diffuse your room is. So they can show you that if you've got frequency buildups over here versus over here, that means you don't have a very diffuse space. And so therefore we need to look at some diffusers. We talked a little bit about some diffusion before. Like we talked about diffusion as a concept, but we're going to talk about specific diffusion methods coming up. We talked about polycylindrical diffusers, which are great, but there's other methods too. So take a lot of take a lot of measurements, but also take good notes when you do this, because you'll think you remember what you did, and then you'll go back and you look at your data and you're like, I don't remember where I did that or what was going on there, because there's no clues, there's no pictures or anything. So you have to take good notes. And then make sure you're not peaking. So make sure that it doesn't sweep. So I usually set level. What I do is I'll set the peak noise first, just make sure that I'm getting my gain going. And so you have a signal generator, and then you have a level meter, and you can just set those two so that the gain and the level are pretty good. And then you also, set the loudness and the mic pregain. So the volume and the mic pregain so that it's nice and hot, but not peaking. Cool. All right. So let's do this. Let's go hop over and jump over into doing the room analysis. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to do like an in-one room analysis of the room that's just on the other side of here. So I'll be right back. So this is, we're going to set this up and do the measurement in this room right here. This is the front of our building. I kind of live in a warehouse, and this used to actually be the recording studio. So this was originally, this was the the control room right here. Then we had more walls here, and that was the tracking room. And now we have like conference rooms and stuff. But we love this. One of the things I loved about the space was the reverb of our room. Our drums sounded so good acoustically. We love the sound of this. We have wood floors here, concrete here, brick around here, and then we have drywall ceilings with insulation behind it, and then we have some drywall here now. So we have kind of a funny layout in terms of in terms of the space, but it's got certainly a live sound to it. So it's worth doing the reverb analysis for this. So let's run through the setup that I've got here real quick. So we've got our measurement microphone. It's omnidirectional, so it doesn't matter which way you point the thing. It doesn't really matter, just as long as you make sure you remember where it was actually positioned. And then we have the speaker over there, and it's facing away from the microphone. So we don't want to actually point it at the microphone if we're doing a reverb analysis. If you want to measure both the reverb and the speaker at the same time to see how well your room is tuned for your speaker room setup, like if you're doing your monitors, that's great. If you want to measuring your control room or even your tracking room, it's worth actually having the speaker point towards the microphone. But in this case, we want to point it away from it because we just want the reverberation characteristics of the room, not the direct signal. And then I have the computer down here and then the interface down here to control everything. So let's run through it. I'll pull it up. I already have Room EQ Wizard pulled up here, but I haven't used it for a while. So let's take a look. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my preferences and take a look at how I have the routing set up in here. Whoops, let's get back to that. You can run at 44.1. This one can run at higher sample rates, but 44.1 for what we're going to be doing today is just great. You can choose the default device, but I want to do Scarlett, and the output device is going to be the Scarlett, and the default output can be left and right. I'm not going to go into you can do this timing reference where you can do a loop back, so you do the output to the input, and that can give you some timing reference, but I'm not going to worry about that. We don't really have to worry about that for us today. So we're just going to use the left output, which I think is what I have set up. Yep, I have the left output set up right there. Buffer 16K, that's fine. So the default device for the input, I also want to use the Scarlett, and I have the microphone set up right here. So let's turn on Phantom, and now it's getting signal, and I can see that it's coming in. Great. On the left input right there. So loopback input would be right here. So what you do is you do the left output to the right. You can do this right here if you want to actually do this loop thing through. Sweep level, we don't really need to change anything in this case right here. We don't need to change anything across the top here, so let's just let this thing do its run in default. So the first thing I'm going to do is get a level before I do any sweeps. So I have to get just a general level, make sure that my microphone's set up and that my speaker's set up right. So the way I usually can do this, I'm going to do generator first. And we've got all these different signal sources we can use, but I'm going to use just pink noise. This is periodic pink noise, or I guess pink noise is fine. I'm going to start at -20, bring my gain all the way down. My gain's up on my speaker right now and it's turned on. So I want to just hit play just to get a relative level, make sure it's working. Cool. Give it a little bit of heat. So that was at -20. So that's coming out of the computer. It's pretty quiet. So I just want to make sure that looks good. And then also I want to make sure that my input levels are pretty good. So I'm going to turn on my input level here and hit play. And so that what I want to do is correlate that the output level is nice and hot and that the input is getting a pretty good level right here. So I'm not going to use this one right here. I'm only using the in right here. So I'm going to play again. I'm adjusting my mic pre. So it's nice and hot. That's pretty good. That should be good. At least get us in the ballpark. So it may end up being too loud or too quiet. So it's a trial and error thing. So that's all we need to worry about right now. We could go through, and I'm not going to go through all the other stuff like the SPL meter, RTA, EQ, room simulation. It's cool, but we don't really need that. So what we're going to do now is hit measure, and it's going to give me a warning saying that it's not calibrated, and that's okay. We don't care about the absolute SPL of this thing. What we care about is the relative. So if you have a calibration, I have like a calibration tool you can stick on the microphone, and it will you can calibrate the thing if you want to. But for this, we don't really care about that. It's just we care about how it's tuned to itself. So I would say continue anyway, and we're looking good here. So we want to go from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. The level's at minus 15. I was doing my calibration at minus 20, so I'm just going to set that to minus 20. The length could be, experiment with these. So the longer that you go, the more resolution you're going to have, but I'm going to leave it default. Do a single sweep, default output, and default input. I'm just going to let everything do its thing, and I'm just going to do a sweep, and it go whoop. And so you want to make sure you try and be really quiet when this is going on. So let's try it and see if it works. And done. So we can take a look at our analysis, our quick analysis right here, make sure everything's looking pretty good. We didn't peak and anything. It's usually out of the gates, it looks pretty fuzzy because this is showing us both our SPL and our phase. What we want to do is we want to look at, if we just look at the SPL, that gives us a little bit more, it gets rid of the phase thing here. The phase is cool, but not for what we're looking for today. And I also want to, it's really fuzzy to look at right here. So I'm going to go under controls, and I'm going to do smoothing as 1/6 octave and apply the smoothing. And that makes it a lot more readable. So what this is showing us, this is the room speaker response. And so if I had the speaker pointing at the microphone, we wouldn't see, it would actually be much flatter across the top here. But because I have the speaker pointing away, it's going to get, the low frequencies diffract, so they're coming straight off the speaker, but the high frequencies are shooting the other direction right now. So that's why we're seeing a lot of like low frequency drop right here. But this will tell you kind of how your speakers are doing. So what we care about though now is, well, actually, we'll do that on the other computer. But what I want to do is go through and take a couple sweeps. So we can take our notes over here. So I'll call this one position 1. And if I had a tape measure, I would actually go through and do a little drawing of the room and do some plots on there so I can remember where I took the measurements right there. But that's all I needed to do. You can expand this out a little bit. And let's just go through and take another couple sweeps just to make sure, as a safety, it doesn't cost anything. So if I were to just move this, for instance, over here, see what changes. Do another sweep. Cool. And let's just do one more over here just for example. But if I were doing a true analysis of the room, I'd be doing this all over the room, taking good notes where I'm doing everything. And do one more. I don't know why something's hung up on it right now. Let's try one more measurement. Let's try doing let's just leave it the same. I don't want to change anything. Cool. All right, so then we want to just go ahead and save. And so you can save these individually, or you can save them as a set. So I'm going to save the set. I want to save all measurements. So this is front room. I'll see about that. I'm gonna save it. I'll just save it to my desktop for right now. Call this front room. And let's just do it on my desktop. Cool. All right. And honestly, that's all there really is to it. So I'm oversimplifying because I already had things kind of set up, but it does take a couple minutes to get set up. But once you get it set up, it goes really fast, and so it's really pretty easy. So cool. Let's go do some analysis and see what we can figure out with this stuff. All right, we're back. Let's do some room analysis. So we went and did the sweep over there. And actually I did that video before, so that wasn't me. Obviously you see I'm wearing different clothes and some of that stuff. That was a video I took before, but it was for last semester because it was kind of a pain to set all that stuff up for today. So, but let's take a look at that room analysis and like deconstruct it a little bit. So what we're going to look at is, we'll pull up Room EQ Wizard here in just a moment. So what I want to do here is look at the frequency response, the RT60, the harmonic distortion, and waterfall and spectrogram analysis. There's so much we can do with this. So let's do this. Let's pull up Room EQ Wizard. Come on. And if you didn't notice this when you're looking at this, that you actually included the MDAT. It's called, that's the .MDAT that you have available. So if you want to download this and poke through this this analysis on your own, that'd be awesome. So, all right. So you don't need to worry about that. It's just a beta thing. So this is the basic Room EQ Wizard setup, and you know, you kind of we looked at it before. But now what we did is we did that sweep, and we saw that we had the frequency response and the phase response. And let's just load that in right now. So I'm going to hit open. And where is that? It's in my acoustics class. There we are. There it is. All right. So what we have here is that for our first one, and just kind of getting comfortable with the interface. You can hit 20 to 20,000. So most of the time, like a lot of times this is used for is low frequency room mode analysis. That's kind of what it defaults to. So I'm going to hit, that's like the 10 to 200 right here. That's like the low frequency stuff. And when you're doing like room tuning and room modes, that's something you want to look at a lot. But then we also want to do 20 to 20,000. So the bright red line in front of here is, that's the phase of it. We don't really care about phase right now. That's for more a different kind of like measurement when you're looking at speaker analysis. So if we all hit all SPL, what we're going to see here is that we have all of our measurements done right here in this, in the three different spaces. So I'm going to do 20K, and then I can zoom up and down on my amplitude. And like we said before, like I showed before, it's like it's pretty fuzzy right there. So if I want to change this, I can change this to let's change it, like basically 1/6 smoothing. Apply smoothing. So now with this, like like we can look at like 148 smoothing, apply smoothing. So that's going to be a little bit more coarse. But generally speaking, the human brain can resolve about a 1/3 octave of like resolution. So basically this is even higher than our brain could discern on there. So like if you look at this stuff, I mean, the one thing that's like, that if you're looking at these like kind of like say 1/24 and look at this, if you start to seeing something that like bounces, like it's a, well, like let me hide two of these. So if you see something that's like bouncing right there, and these ones like maybe it's not so obvious right here, but usually what that's going to imply is comb filtering, right? So when we see that, when we see bounces that look very, very regular, these ones look very regular, but remember it has to be on a logarithmic scale, so they should be squishing up. That if you see something like that's hopping and bouncing, that's usually indicative of comb filtering, which means you're getting a reflection. So, but since we're not doing a direct sound and then reflections, we're probably not going to get much comb filtering with this one. But it is good to note that comb filtering does show up a lot. So like if you're next to a hard desk and you like, if you're next to a hard surface and you have the speaker pointing at you, you're going to see that comb filtering right there. All right, so let's go 1/6 and yeah, apply smoothing to all of them. And we'll just leave it at that for right now. I have to turn it on and then do it. Here we go. Cool. There's some other stuff you can do in here, but we'll call that good. So this is just the frequency response. And this is if you're going to be doing something like frequency response of your speakers. So if you just want to like measure your speakers in a room, this is what's hitting my ears. Now, in this case, like I mentioned in the video, it's pointing away, the speaker's pointing away from me, and therefore the low frequencies are going to bend and the high frequencies are going to beam. And since the speaker's not pointing towards me, I'm going to get a high frequency roll off there. And what we can see here is that likely what's happening is this is probably the crossover region right here from the tweeter to the woofer, but basically it's pushing the sound away from me here, but the low frequencies diffract around the speaker, so we get a pretty good response on the low frequencies here. So you could also, and I didn't do it in the video, I probably should have. I should have done one where it's facing towards you as well. So if you want to take a sweep with the microphone and the speaker right there, and do it one speaker at a time. Don't do it with both speakers. The reason, once again, we talk about this notion of comb filtering. If I have the same sound coming out of both speakers right there, and unless you're absolutely dead center between those speakers, and when I say absolutely, I mean within a centimeter of dead center of those two speakers, you're gonna get comb filtering, because you're getting basically time delay between the two speakers right there hitting that microphone. So that's going to be a problem. But usually when you want to do this, you'll do like the left speaker and then you'll do the right speaker. And it'll show you, and it's actually really good to do this. You can see how similar your left and your right speaker responses are. So maybe your speakers are set up in a room and you're next to a wall. And you're going to be getting weird reflections off that wall from the right speaker. And then the left speaker, it's going to be an open space. And you'll be like, huh. So this would be like, well, I'm seeing that there's two differences in amplitude and response and maybe some comb filtering. And that will tell you like what you need to do. And what most people kind of freak out with, especially on the RubyQ Wizard forums, is like these people go out. A lot of audiophiles will go out and spend $10,000 on a pair of speakers, and they are assured that if they spend $10,000 on a pair of speakers, that these are the best things, they're the flattest things, like they're the most biggest bandwidth. And then they go through and they do a sweep of this, and they're horrified oftentimes at the response of their speakers. They're like, why did I just spend $10,000 and I see all this? Well, usually what happens is they look at something like this. They'll be something like, look at it, say like here, and they're like, oh my gosh, I see all these crazy ups and downs. Like if I just look at the blue one for a moment, they're going to be like, what is this gigantic? Because if we look at this from 70, that's like, we'll say 70 down to like 55. That's a pretty big differential right there in terms of frequency response. And so people freak out that they're like, oh my God, the frequency response of my speakers are terrible. You're like, no. Your frequency response to your speakers are actually probably fine. That's actually the room in there. And also just that's the room effects of reflections and reverb and everything that's happening there. But it should also note that it's that most like what this isn't even zoomed in that far, but what most manufacturers, if you look at like frequency response of like frequency plots of speakers, this is what they're going to look like, right? So we just zoom out. So like if I were to look at this and be like, oh wow, yeah, that looks pretty flat. And you're like, wait a minute, look at the scale over here. And so what you need to really do is look at the scale. And most manufacturers lie quite a bit with this stuff. Also, because basically what they're doing is they're going to give you anechoic performance. But as soon as you put a speaker in a room, the room is part of the speaker room system. And so therefore, this is actually what's hitting my brain. And I should also say things like, one of the things I like saying is that microphones don't lie. So in the audiophile world, they love talking about all this, like they come up with these kind of crazy harebrained ways of like tuning your room and speaker placement. And it's got a lot of voodoo and there's a lot of like pseudo fake science in there where you try to get this to sound just right. Moving it 3 degrees this way is going to change the sound of your speakers. You're like, well, maybe, but hook it up to microphone. Microphones don't lie. So, and the thing is like, we're emotional beings. If I'm having a bad day or if I've had couple drinks or something like that, the response of my brain and my ear hearing system is going to change. Whereas if I take a microphone and I put it in the same position every time, it's never going to change. It does not lie. So it's important that I think you use microphones for tuning your rooms and tuning your systems. So, okay, let's take a look at one of these. So let's look at, let's pick the green one here for a minute. So what we can do here is we can look at our distortion. So this is if we want to look at our harmonic distortion. So let's pull this down. We talked a little bit about this before. So this is more if you're doing directly on with the speaker. This isn't more of a reverb analysis. This is just a speaker analysis. But what we see here is this. So the brown is the fundamental. This is my frequency response. And then this is looking at all the different, the red one is my second harmonic. Then where's my third? Third is right there. Fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. So what we're going to do is, so THD right here. So this is the black one right here is my THD. So that's showing my distortion as a function of frequency. So what we're looking at here is we can look at our frequency response relative to basically what they're doing is you take the fundamental and you sum up all the rest of these and you do a ratio of the fundamental to the sum of the harmonics. And that gives you your harmonic distortion. In this case, again, you don't usually use this for reverb analysis. This is more for speaker analysis. So if you put it near a speaker and you want to see, if you see that you have something like a spike, like going up here, like this one right here, that may or may not, I don't know what that, let's see which harmonic is that? Oh, that's the noise floor. Okay, so that's just the noise. But if you see that you have a mega spike right there, that'll usually mean that you have something rubbing or something vibrating in your room or something like that. It's usually an indication of some sort of issue, or you maybe have a leak in your speaker cabinet, or it creates some sort of weird harmonic distortion. So this is a good idea to run it on your speakers to see if there's like anything bizarro happening. If you see a giant spike somewhere, or like if you see something weird happening, this looks like pretty good. Like that's actually really good. But that's again because we have the speaker pointed away, so we're not really going to see a whole lot of distortion there. So if we look at the impulse right here by itself, we're looking at, so you can see these humps right there. That's the comb filtering right there. But what we do, so the dark green, which is kind of harder to see, the dark green in the background right there, that's hopping over here, that's my original impulse. That's the response to my original impulse. And then this blue line is what we do is we gated it at 500 milliseconds. So it's after 500 milliseconds, we kind of gated this thing off. And actually I should change that. Let's bump that up a little bit. So the way you do that one is it's in my preferences. Actually, I should show something here. So here's, if you want to use a calibration file, if your microphone comes with a calibration file, this is where you're going to load that. So it comes, I don't really know what that is. Never use that. House curve. Yeah, I don't use that either. So on this analysis right here, okay, so it's truncating after 1.7 seconds right there. So this does this impulse response calibration. Basically what it does, it says T0 at impulse response peak, and then decimate the IR. So basically truncate impulse response after 1.7 seconds. So you can actually chop that off. Let's see what else we have in here. 25. Yeah, I think this is fine. This is a lot to get into all this stuff. This EQ thing is pretty neat. So you can actually have it, it'll tell you how to set your equalizer to flatten it out, which is kind of neat. We'll change some of your view stuff here. But we see this green thing, and that's going to be some of those reflections. So what they do is they truncate this off, and the lighter green right here is essentially the energy decay. And so this is on a decibel level right here. So you can see that it's kind of a flat response here, and then it levels out because that's my noise floor over here. So if we look at this as a filtered impulse response, we can actually see this thing. So here we are, and we see our nice clean line right here. If we have that's what we want to see, is we want to see a fairly straight line right there. This is like when we were talking about those perfectly diffuse rooms, like those a few lectures ago. What we don't want to see is any weird steps. And that usually means that there's something else happening, like you have a coupled space, like a secondary room in there or something along those lines. This is a pretty good one that we have going on right here. And what we can do is, like, you can see that it's giving us our top 5, T30. I'm not really going to worry about that. These are all like acoustician terms. I'm not really going to spend the time on that right now. But, and then we can look at like group delay. So it's a little outside of scope of what we're talking about today. Not really important. What we do care about is this RT60. So the RT60 right here tab is just going to show us our reverb time as a function of frequency. So we have our top DT. I don't really know what EDT is, but our T30, so our top T, basically what we're looking at here, and they're all kind of the same, is that we can see what the reverb time is as a function of frequency. So if we're looking at, and it's usually done in different octaves here, we can see that most of the reverb time here is going to be, and this is at like 1 second at around 500 hertz. And it's like, so yeah, it's a whole second right there. So when we were doing this like T20, T30, remember when I was saying that so T20 and T30 is the top 20 and the top 30. So what it's doing is they're basically looking at the reverb time. It's a RT20 and RT30, because those are the most important parts of reverb. That's what's the most audible. The quiet stuff in reverb we don't notice as much, and so that's why we're using these T20 and T30. But then what they do is they extrapolate that out to be T60, RT60, so that we have like the full time length right here. So basically what they do is they do the T20 and then multiply by 3, and that's where this plot comes from. And then they do the T30 and multiply that by 2 to get these plots over here. But if we just look at, let's take a look at, let's look at T30 for a minute here. So what we can see here is that my reverb time at 500 hertz is about like 967 milliseconds. So it's going to be, yeah, like almost a second. But then this is kind of strange. At 160 hertz, I'm only getting about half a second. And then up here, it's 897 at what is that, like 1.5 kilohertz. So we can see that, and then down here the reverb it drops off pretty quickly down here. That's probably not really the case. We're gonna see another way of looking at this. There's gonna be a lot of noise down there. But yeah, but this is pretty interesting. Like, it gives us a clue. So this is the kind of like, if you just want to get a quick one. I don't usually look at these RT60 plots like this. I don't really. I mean, it's I guess it's useful. Generally, what we like in an ideal world, what we want to see is fairly even plot. So I want this thing to be fairly flat. And the reason, if I get flat RT60 is going to result in a neutral sounding reverb. It's going to be fairly natural sounding. So if I want something that's going to be a warmer sounding reverb, we roll off the highs and emphasize the lows. And if I want like a brighter sounding reverb, I'm going to emphasize the highs and de-emphasize the lows. So depending on what materials you put in your room are going to determine that. But basically, kind of our objective is to have a flat one here. So let's take a look at this. Like there's these other ones, clarity. It shows you how clear. I don't really know how this is. I don't usually deal in clarity, but it determines how clearly you can hear like human voice in that space. And let's do decay. I don't really do this one. This is another way of looking at it. Basically, it's looking at the frequency and it's slicing it in time. And so we can say, okay, like what's dropping off fastest, and so you can kind of hover over and see what's happening over the course of time, and seeing if there's any kind of warbles or weirdness happening over the length of time. So basically, what it's doing is, this is low frequency. Let's go to high frequency. So it's doing snapshots in time. So at 60 milliseconds, 120 milliseconds, 120, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, and 160. So it's pretty small, like pretty narrow window, but it does kind of show you what's happening as a slice. Where this is essentially the same thing, looking at the waterfall data here. All right, so what this is going to show us, and let's see, yep, 2020. And what we're looking for here is, let's pull this down a little bit. So this is only showing up to 300 milliseconds right here. So we can change the scale on that if we wanted to make it longer. Actually, let's make that longer. Let's go, instead of time range, let's bump that up to, say, 1 second. Cool. So now what we're doing here is we're looking at this over the course of 1 second. So high frequencies up here, low frequencies down here. And what we're seeing is the energy. So it's low frequencies to high frequencies, then amplitude on this axis, and then we can see in time. So time 0 is at the back, and it's coming towards us. We call this a waterfall plot. And we already see we have a lot of nonlinearity just in the frequency response of this thing. But what we want to see is fairly even drop-off right here. And there's nothing sticking out really tons. We do see that at those low frequencies down here, we do see we have some crazy kind of interference. And that's usually because that's just going to be rooms just make a lot of low frequency sound. And especially when you excite them, they tend to resonate. Rooms resonate themselves. We're going to talk about room modes coming up soon, but you can actually do the math and you can see like, what the hell is this spike right here? It's like at 56 Hertz. It seems like something really like, it seems like it's getting louder. In fact, it's sticking up. So usually you can kind of disregard the super low frequency stuff. This is like an indicator of like, if you want to quiet your room down, this usually means you just need to throw we need to talk about low frequency absorption, which we're going to talk a lot about. But generally across the board here, we're seeing pretty good. We don't see any like really long fins, like kind of like this. This is usually considered something bad. That means like, and if I do it with, let's just try it with, let's see if it's with all of these. Okay, so move down a little bit over there, and let's do it with the red one. And so this is why you take a lot of them, because you're like, okay, so yep, I'm still seeing it with the red and the green. So that's just two different similar measurements. But if I move this thing around, you take a lot of different measurements. You're like, okay, so if this thing is just constantly there, that means there's something wrong with the room and I need to address that. But as I move around, you can see what changes as I move around to see if anything happens there. So we call this the waterfall. The waterfall. It's really useful. It's a really good way of looking at the information. But yeah, I kind of have to zoom around and zoom in and move around to like get this thing to work. Let's bump this up a little bit. Let's see if we can see anything. So we don't see any huge shark fins sticking out here, but remember this is like super quiet. So if we look at the spectrogram right here, so spectrogram looks at it in the same kind of manner, but instead of looking at it coming towards us, we're going to look down on it. So I'm going to look at 20 to 200. So what we have here is this is time 0 that goes in this direction right here. So this is time, this is frequency across. And then we can look at those, like the red being the tallest peak and the dark blue being the lowest. So we can see it's like a topo map coming towards us right here. And so what we can see is that, I don't know what that black dash line is. I haven't really spent time considering that. Oh, I think that's just how long it hangs on, I guess. I don't know really what that is. Yeah, I guess those are just kind of like an indicator of the reverb time at that particular frequency. But what this gives us an indicator here, and again, what we want to see is this to be relatively smooth across here. And we can see that once again at around like between the 500 and 600 hertz range, that these are hanging on the longest. So I can zoom in a little bit if I want to. Let's see if I can do it here. So I can do, oh cool, we have different colors. We can do flame. Yeah, those are cool. Stick with rainbow. But top dB is 71. This is not calibrated. Bottom scale. So I think it's defaulted pretty good right here. But you can zoom in and out and move around. And what we can see here is that the reverb in this case tends to be hanging on pretty good between the 200 and 2000 hertz range right here. We do see we have these kind of weird peaks down here. This is just HVAC, din, room noise. of just like, this is just like, you'll see this a lot in most rooms, that you're going to have just a kind of a general low frequency rumble. But I mean, if we think about this in terms of Fletcher-Munson curves, this is below kind of our threshold of hearing. Well, it's not below our threshold, but we're not very sensitive at these low frequencies right here. So in terms of subjectiveness, we don't really hear this one right here. This is just a scope that shows the sweep. They're going to show it. I don't know where it is. Doesn't really matter. But where we spend most of the time here is we look at the waterfall and the spectrogram, and also like the RT60 and then the SPL. So the SPL just gives you kind of an overall picture of what's happened, but this doesn't show you giving any time information, whereas things like a waterfall and spectrogram both include time, frequency, and amplitude information, which is pretty cool. So the trick is though, like, yeah, so I'm just talking about this in terms of reverberation. You can glean other information out of this. Things like if you're talking about standing waves, like how much of this, so when we talk about speaker room coupling, how much of this is the effects of the speaker and how much of this is the effects of the room? Because we can see clearly that the high frequencies are rolling off, and that's because the speaker is pointing away from us. But if I point the speaker towards you, you're like, okay, so now I've got some craziness here. Is it the speaker or is it my room that's screwed up? And generally speaking, that the low frequencies are the room, the higher frequencies are going to be your speaker. Or actually, more if you're looking at this. If you're looking at this, like if I see some weirdness down here, the low frequencies are going to be controlled, like this response is going to be controlled by your room, as this stuff's going to be controlled by mostly your speaker. And where this line is, that's a little bit up for interpretation. So, okay. So I think I want to talk about the room analysis right now, because there's more that we could like talk about this thing, but it's we need some more information, so we have to go further with the class. But I would strongly recommend, and so like I posted this MDAT right here, so that's what these are saved as. And so if you want to download this set, you can download this set and experiment with this, or even better, go record your own if you want to get into this stuff. And like I said, it's like, even if you're not going to be an acoustician, if you're just being not just, but if you're just working in the studio, and you want to just find out how your speakers hold up, you should do this on your home setup. If you go so far as to get something like SonarWorks, so SonarWorks, what they do is it does all this stuff for you behind the scenes, and then it does all the speaker correction for you with some inline software. And so the SonarWorks setup, I don't even know what it's going for, maybe $100 or something like that, where you get the microphone and the software, which is pretty sweet. I think the SonarWorks stuff is pretty fantastic, and for some of you out there that have been playing with it, it's pretty neat how it works. So it flattens out all your stuff for you, and it does all the sophisticated DSP to make it flatten it out. So all of a sudden you can hear your music and not the speaker. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, let's get back to it. Let's talk about what else we got here. So there's a lot you can play around with it. So I encourage you to experiment with it. And if you do start experimenting with it, come back and talk to me with questions and ask me questions about it. I'll be doing more demos with it throughout the rest of the semester. If we were on campus, I would make everybody go do this would be part of your project would be to go do a room analysis. But it's really fun to go like learn. And the way you learn this stuff is by doing a lot of measurements, because you can start to see like when you start to see versus what you hear and correlate the two, then it really starts to become real. It's pretty neat. Okay, so when we talk about things like reverberation characteristic, so when I said the rate at which different frequencies decay yield something of a room timbre. So once again, rooms don't make that sound themselves, but they influence the sound in the rooms. So if I have something like, so if I were in a wooden room, for instance, wood absorbs sound at a particular frequency at a certain rate, and therefore it's like when we talk about color, like something that's red is absorbing everything but red and reflecting red. And so we go, oh yeah, that's red. Well, wood is sort of the same thing. When sound hits wood, it's going to reflect and it's going to absorb some of the sound in a certain way. In fact, the way that our brain, we're able to interpret the reflections having different timbral quality than the original sound, in such a way that we learned that sounds like what we call a wooden sound. So we're like, oh, it sounds like it's like a wooden room. So a wooden room has a particular quality of sound to it, or a concrete room, or a brick room, or like different materials have a different quality of sound to them, what we call timbre. And so we learn to like associate those. And so different rooms, you're going to want to have different reverbs for them. So, I kind of mentioned that generally speaking, we're shooting for a neutral. If you want a neutral reverb, you want something that falls with a fairly flat reverb, like a fairly flat waterfall. But that's not always the case. You don't always want that. So like recording in, say, a room that has a lot of concrete. So like I like the sound of like concrete and wooden and like drywall rooms. They have a kind of a cool natural quality because that's the world we live in. So I like having that. So you don't always want that. So having those different materials can enhance that kind of quality of that room, which is kind of cool. So, and we call that like the reverb characteristic of it. So you can just, that's what you would describe the sound of a room. Okay, and let's talk about optimum reverb times. So I've mentioned before that basically we want to get a neutral reverb, we want it to roll off fairly flat across the spectrum. But what about the reverb time itself? So when we talk about something being RT60, so in the beginning, like when we're first doing it, we're like those steady state calculations we did last time. Basically, we're doing RT60 overall. So you can say, what's the RT60 of a room? You'd be like, oh, it's 1.6 seconds. Well, like, well, that's a loaded number because the 1.6 seconds doesn't tell us anything about the frequency response, the frequency information. So that's why when we do these, like Sabine's formula, or when we do these measurements, we look at it as a function of frequency because that's also going to give you a lot more information. But when we talk about RT60 in general conversation, as we all do, right? We all talk about RT60 all the time. So, but when we talk about, in my world, I do actually talk about it quite a bit. But when we talk about RT60, what we're going to say is things like it's got like a 2-second reverb time or 1.5 second reverb time, or maybe like a 0.5 second reverb time. Well, what's right for what particular venue? And there is no such thing as perfect reverb time. So there's no such thing as ideal for all situations. So different rooms and spaces need different reverb times for different uses. So for speech, we need intelligibility. For music, we want a sense of envelopment space. So this is, like I mentioned before, this is a challenge for churches where you're doing both of those kind of things in there. And we're talking about the classic analog church where there's no electronics in there. This is tough. You have to make it a kind of a balance between the two of those. In modern performance halls and lecture halls, we now have added electronics. So we can like usually make the room a little more dead, and we can add reverb in later, like post with fake reverb if we want to give something like more reverb. But yeah, there's no such thing as reverb. There's no such thing as ideal. So like listening control rooms usually want it to be pretty dead because we want to hear the speakers, not the reflection in the room. So you want to hear what's really there, the music, not all this reflection. But you don't want it to be too dead. Well, some people don't want it to be too dead because they want to be able to feel like they do want that sense of envelopment. I like my room's super dead. I've mentioned this a few times, but like my room in here, my entire ceiling is insulation because I have like joisted ceilings, and then so it's like you can't see it. Maybe I'll take pictures of it and show it, but I have like a completely like it's like 16 inches of insulation, a fiberglass insulation above me, because between the joists, and then I just covered it with burlap and had stapled it to the ceiling. So my ceiling is like crazy absorbent, and then I have giant 4 foot by 8 foot absorbent panels all around me here, and then I have like a rug on the ground. I have concrete floors, but this room is really dead, and I love it that way because I like to hear my speakers, not the room. But when other people work in this room, that feels too dead for them. They like it to have a little bit of space. And so I would say that the studios on campus, they have a fairly natural, like a fairly neutral reverb time. So so when we're talking about the sense of scale and reverb time, so the sense of scale would be like a reverb time would be something like between 0.2 and 2 seconds. That's like a kind of a wide range. 0.2 would be really dead. 2 seconds would be really reverberant. You can, like Taj Mahal, I think is something like a reverb time of like 7 or 8 seconds, or maybe even up to 10 or something like that. Like crazy, because it's super huge and super reflective. And so therefore you're going to have a really long reverb time. If you want to plug that into Sabine's formula, you can figure all that stuff out. It's like tile, right? It's like really thick concrete with tile on the front of it. And it's going to be, that's going to have like an insanely long reverb time. In fact, there's demos of it where like you'll have a violinist that when they play in there, they can be their own, they can play along with themselves as they play. There's a meme going around with that saxophone player with a tube doing the same sort of thing, where it's like these really long reverb times in a tube, and the saxophone player can play along with themselves as an accompaniment. It's kind of cool. But generally speaking, we're talking like, so for me, like I love reverb time of about 1.2 to 1.5 second for drums. I think that sounds like amazing. That's like the money spot for me. But most of our studios on campus are not that reverberant. So maybe if you're in, like if you're Studio H in the big blue room, that's usually Metro uses. That's a pretty good sounding drum room too. Because I like to use natural reverb. I like to leverage using natural reverb. It sounds more real than using fake reverb. So I like using that. So all right, so let's take a look at this. This is a church right here. So this is like churches. So it also depends on the size of the space. So if I'm talking about 100,000 cubic foot church right here, this is going to be like where we want the reverb time. So they're saying between, say, about like right here, if I'm at 100,000 square foot. So this is one with more speech down here. So we'll say that that's a reverb time of about 1 second up to about, say, 2.5 seconds. So between 1 and 2.5 seconds is like a good reverb time for a church. For like, and I don't know, you'd have to do the math. I don't know. I can't even envision what 100,000 square feet looks like. Like, I guess it's like 100 times 100 times 100. Is that right? Yeah. No, that's like 100,000. No, maybe that's right. Yeah, I think that might be right. Yeah, 100,000 would be 100 feet by 100 feet by 100 feet. So that's pretty good size. That's pretty good size space. But as we get larger, we're going to have like more reverb time up here. So anyway, that's kind of like, this is kind of a rule of thumb, so to speak. So how about for concert halls? So concert halls here, so like lighter music, I don't know what they mean here. Symphonic music on top, where symphonic, we tend to usually classical music, we really want to have a lot of reverb. That's one of the defining characteristics of like classical music is the reverberation tail. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in critical listening. But here we want to have, basically they're showing it's actually a little bit tighter here. So for 100,000 cubic foot space, we want to be about what, 0.75 to 1.75. Yeah, I think that sounds pretty good. Seems a little like, in fact, I could go even higher than that. But 100 feet by 100 feet by 100 feet is not that big for a concert hall. So, but for like a show, like say you're doing a venue, like a punk rock venue or something like that, like, or maybe like an electronic club, you don't want a lot of reverb in there. In fact, I went back in the day when I used to like help build clubs and stuff every once in a while. Like just, it was a punk rock thing to do. We all just chip in and build clubs. And, it was like one of the early Soda Jerk venues. It was called the Cat. And it was basically, Mike was like, yeah, he's like, he was kind of bragging to me. He's like, it's all concrete. It's awesome. It's so loud in there. I was like, no. You don't want it to be all super loud. Like he was proud of the fact that it was like all cinder block, like room with fairly low ceilings that were acoustic tiled ceilings. Well, like not like the suspended ceilings. They're like the old, like 60s, like nailed in tiled ceilings. But he was like, yeah, so like basically it was his impression that the louder we, like, if it was more reverberant in there, it was going to be louder, which means he didn't need to buy as big amps and big speakers. The problem is when you have a highly reverberant space like this, it's going to, well, first off, everything was rectangular, so you're going to have a ton of flutter echo. Second is that you also get massive feedback. Like engineering a show like that is really difficult because I started out engineering at a club in Boulder that was all brick, and it was just wild feedback all the time because we had so much like reflections in there. But the second part of it is that it's unintelligible. So it's loud, but it just sounds like a wall of noise. You can't hear what's going on. So I had to like really like talk him away from that idea that we want it to be like really echoey in there. We want it to like highly reverberant. We wanted it to be much deader. And so if you go to these bigger venues that are dedicated, well, which I mean, Soda Jerk has since gone on and done great things. You know, did Summit and Marquee and some of these other venues. Marquee doesn't have a lot of like a ton of a treatment in it, but if you look like something like Summit or some of these other bigger halls, they tend to have a lot of treatment and they sound really good. So you get a larger sound system with more damping in the space, and it's going to sound really good because you're going to have like a lot of transient. So because you can always add reverb if you want to add more verb in there. But then you look at some of these older venues, look at something like the Ogden or the Bluebird or Gothic, those theaters that are like these old performance theaters that have been since turned into concert venues. They don't tend to have a lot of treatment in them, and they're very loud. Or even like the Oriental up in the Highlands, all those spaces are going to be very reverberant, and they're not very good for like doing like loud shows. We go to them because we love those spaces, and I played a lot of shows and been to a lot of shows in those spaces, but they don't actually sound that great tend to not sound that great unless they've done some treatment to those spaces, usually by adding some damping material in there. So this is for like symphonic type materials. Also, so speech and recording. So this is like for a recording studio. So auditoriums for speech or recording studios. So recording studio here. So if we're talking like a 100 or 10,000 10,000 cubic foot, which would be like, I guess it's harder to talk about that one. It's like it would be more like 100 by 100 by 10. So that's still a giant space right there. But we can see right here, we're well within like if we're talking like a small, like this is 10, 20, 30, 40, or I don't know, this is 1,000 square, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5, 6, 7, yeah, somewhere in there. It's good. These lines are kind of drawn funny. But if we're talking about like 1,000 square foot space, maybe down here somewhere, 1,000 square foot space, which is still a pretty good sized space, you want it to have a reverb time of like about a half a second. And that's probably pretty true of like Studio G. I think that might be a pretty good example of something like that. And so it's going to have a fairly dead space, dead in there. And in fact, in Studio G, if you've not been in there, basically it has curtains that you can open up and shut to get variable acoustics. So you can adjust your reverb time in there if you want to. So that's kind of cool. But we can see that like for most of the stuff, like for speech and recording, we want to have much tighter. In fact, a lot of times, like for vocal booths in particular, you want vocal booths, you want to be completely dead because you want to add the reverb back in on top of that with synthetic reverb. So this was just kind of an interesting little tidbit. Like I don't know why they threw this in, but this is talking about living room reverb times. So they did a survey here of like the average living room, average 50 living rooms here. So this is now they're giving to us some frequency here and reverb time here, and so this is just like overall energy. It's not by frequency. So if we look at like we can see that it's pretty dead at the upper frequencies and it grows at the lower frequencies. So we're talking about like a living room. So it's going to have, well, we could say more or less around a half a second of reverb time. So, and that's going to be like, because you have couches and absorbent materials in there, but most modern, many modern living rooms these days are going to be, I think they describe it in the book, but living rooms, modern living spaces tend to be a lot more stark and harsh. Like we do hardwood floors, we do concrete floors. And so there's a lot less absorbent material in those spaces. And so the reverb times have gone up. And it's like, in fact, like the room that I was talking about that I did the measurement in for the reverb time that's like an office, right? So, and that's kind of like a modern typical office where we have concrete floors and hard surfaces with very little. And the problem is, well, for my wife that works up in there, she's in there by herself right now, so it's not a big deal. But when you have multiple people in there, because the energy, you can hear everything. Like that sound energy just doesn't go away. So like if somebody's talking on the phone on the other side of the room, it just fills the whole room with like talking. I hate it. I like dead spaces. That's how I roll. But in like older systems, so and this also goes back to we were talking about like absorption coefficients. So we can see that like if I have a carpeted room, it's going to absorb these high frequencies pretty well, but it's not going to absorb these low frequencies. Those low frequencies are going to linger a little bit longer in those spaces right there. So anyway, it's kind of like, hopefully this is starting to glue some like of these concepts together, because this is like where we're starting to see like absorption, diffusion, reflection, and reverb times and frequency response and all this kind of stuff. It starts to like, we're starting to get like a holistic picture of how sound works in a room. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about this for just really briefly here, just because we're going to spend more time on this when we get into it in critical listening and probably in some of your other classes, but we talk about artificial reverb. So the old school way of doing this is doing with a reverb chamber. So what we do is, in this case, what we do is take a microphone and we take two speakers, we pipe in the speakers. So say you recorded it fairly dead and you want to add reverb to it. We take this room right here, and basically they have splayed walls in this room, so there's no flutter echo. And we take a microphone here, and then I'm sure there's another microphone off screen down here. And what they do is they play this back, and they aim it not at the microphone itself, and it basically plays it back, and you hear just the reverb of this thing. So still used sometimes, but it's big and not great use of space. We've done this actually a number of times. When I do, well, not anymore in that space, because that used to be the recording studio. But when we had the recording studio in there, when we would mix outside projects, our drum room sounded so good that we would actually, what we would do is we would reamp essentially our drums and do reverb. We'd make our room into a reverb chamber. And so it sounded like actually it was recorded in our space because our drums sounded so good in the space. So what we could do is we did exactly this. We pumped out sounds out of the monitors, pointed them away, and then we put up room mics in the room, and we just added that back into the system, and it sounded amazing. Sounds great. I mean, there's a bunch of synthetic reverbers out there that are great now, but this is something for us that gave a sense of cohesiveness and glue. So we could even do this on vocals. You can do this on anything. And as soon as you add a little bit of constant same reverb between a lot of different instruments, it gives them the impression that they're all recorded in the same space. So, and that gives you that sense of an ensemble playing it. Because even though you did this as overdub where we recorded one instrument at a time, by adding just the same amount of reverb, a little bit of reverb on each of the instruments, different amounts, but all the same kind of reverb, that it gives it this impression that they're all in the same space. And that's something that we oftentimes like to have. I mean, it's not always what you want, but I mean, look at something like in the 80s, right? 80s hair metal. Like they always had that snare that goes boosh, boosh, like, right? But none of the rest of the drums have that kind of reverb on it. Like that that's very, like, doesn't make any sense. But it became kind of an iconic sound of that era where we have like the snare has this massive reverb on it, but nothing else does. And you're like, that's just weird. And then the vocals will have a different kind of reverb, and maybe some of the other instruments have a different kind of reverb. And so sometimes you do want that as just an artistic choice, but it kind of depends on what you're going for. So if we talk about other analog kind of reverbs, we have plate reverbs and spring reverbs. So plate reverbs, you use a gigantic plate in there, you excite it with a transducer, and then the sound energy bounces around on a steel plate in very similar fashion as it does for sounds bouncing around in a room. And so you can actually emulate this effect very, very well. It's pretty cool. We have some really cool, the EMT 160s, EMT 160s at school, which, again, we'll talk more about that, especially when we get to class and get to start working in the studios a lot more next semester. Hopefully everything's like smooth. That's when we really get to like put this information to use. Spring reverbs, that's usually more like, you find those on like guitars and stuff. You don't really see them used a lot of other places, but the way that the energy bounces around on a spring actually is kind of chaotic in the same manner as it would reflecting off of surfaces there. We'll talk more about this in critical listening though. But, and then we talk about like digital reverb. So a digital reverb, so the traditional digital reverb is what it is. It's basically use delay lines. So remember what we did is when we were talking about how reverb works is you have your person and your sound source, and it's just, you have your direct sound and then you have a reflection. And each of one of those reflections is effectively a delay. So what we do is we just use a lot of delays, and every time it delays, it feeds back on itself and it reduces in amplitude. But if we add like mega amounts of delays on top of each other, that's what reverb does in a room. And so we can emulate that using just we call them delay lines, where they're just many delay lines. But the thing is, this is extremely simple, like extremely CPU intensive. So the density of the delays correlate to the quality of reverb. So the more delays I have means how dense that reverb is, which is going to be better sounding, but it also uses a lot more CPU to do this. So reverbs traditionally have been very, very, very CPU intensive, and they still are. I mean, a good reverb still eats up a lot of CPU. So this is why you use aux sends instead of having a reverb on every single channel, because it's much more effective to do it that way. But then the other way we do it is we use convolution reverbs. And I've already alluded to this a couple times today, but it's basically what you do is you take an impulse. So an impulse, as we've seen in excruciating detail, is a acoustic snapshot of a room. So it has frequency, time, and amplitude information. And what we do is essentially we take that impulse and we multiply that by our incoming signal, and it gives us the sound as if we were in that room. So you convolve the impulse with the original audio signal. So convolving means like multiplying by in a oversimplified sense, and it essentially acts as if you were playing in that sound in that space. And so this is like, it used to be kind of more boutique for this sort of thing, but now we see them everywhere. And this is the only kind of reverb I use. I don't use traditional digital reverbs anymore. I just don't like them. They just don't sound real to me. So they all sound fake and bizarre and bad and nasty. So I mean, you can go spend some good ones. There are some good ones. Like, I mean, you talk about like Valhalla, or you talk about Valhalla from Valhalla reverb, but then you also which, if you've not played with that, download it. There's the Supermassive is free. The other ones are more expensive, but they have the Valhalla Supermassive. If you've not played with it, it's cool. They're crazy. It's a different algorithmic reverb. It's badass. The other one is called Black Hole by Eventide, and that's another one. And they do some really bizarro stuff with reverb. If you want to get wacky with reverbs, play with both those two reverbs, and just like go listen to them. You can do some wild stuff with them. They're pretty neat. It's a refreshing new approach to digital reverbs, which is cool. But I almost always exclusively use convolution reverbs now, because you can find impulses. There's impulse libraries all over the internet. You can you can download them and apply them, or even better, you can go capture your own. And you can capture your own impulses and apply them. But there's also sorts of great ones. Like most of them will come with like I think mine came like my Revelation came with something like 2 gigs worth of samples of impulses. But what's cool is you can actually export those impulses and use them in other convolution reverbs and stuff, and surround and all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty cool. So, but yeah, it's very realistic sounding. And I think for me, like, I'm a kind of a purist. I like stuff to sound like pretty natural sounding, even if I'm working on electronic instruments and I'm adding reverb. Although I will say that when I was saying like, when we would do something very Ableton heavy or synth based, we would still actually reamp those synths out into the space of our room and it gave it like this subtle glue that it's hard to put into words what it does. It's amazing. So, but you can use convolution reverb in the same manner. So even if you're using electronic instruments, if you just add it almost so that's inaudible, but added just a hair in there, it will add like a certain amount of like cohesion to your set. And if that's what you're going for, I mean, you don't always want that. So, or you can giveth and taketh away. Like that's part of your palette is you can like, especially if you're talking like in electronic domain, if you want to give them like a lot of reverb and then pull it away and give it a really flat 2-dimensional sound, and then because like obviously reverb gives us a sense of depth, and so you can make stuff feel like it's like zooming in and out and flattening out. You can use that as kind of your techniques, like one of your expression techniques. So pretty interesting. So when I say use this, like if you have the means, like go find it. There's like, unfortunately, if you're working in Pro Tools, they don't give you a Pro Tools one for free because it's Pro Tools. They just don't do that. But any other DAW, like pretty much every other DAW out there has, in fact, even like Reaper comes with a free convolution one. I don't know what it's called, something or other, because it's Reaper. So, but Reaper has a pretty good convolution reverb. So if you want to experiment with this, and you can get it for free. But Ableton the Ableton one is great. It used to be just a Max for Live device, but now they include it with just with Live itself. So, and it's a fun one because you can also just convolve weird sounding stuff. Like I can take an impulse of inside of my microwave, and I can pop a balloon, or I can go outside into a dumpster, or I can go do weird spaces, and I can convolve so it make it sound like my band is playing inside of a microwave or something like that. So you can do strange spaces. And if you look through the thing, there's all sorts of strange stuff. Like a lot of times they'll do weird ones, but also look online. I think it's called IR. Oh man, what's it called? It's a repository for impulse responses online. So people go out, and it's like bird watching, but they do impulse hunting, right? You go out and you find interesting spaces and you collect impulses. Sounds weird, but it's pretty stinking fun. So, like maybe that's like, instead of bird watching when I get older, I'm going to move into impulse capturing and field recording. I still do field recording, but I'm going to do more of that kind of stuff. So, all right, my friends. So that's all we really have for this. So that's they talk about it in the book a little bit more about the kind of like the electronic stuff in terms of the digital reverbs. I'm not going to go into that, but this kind of gives us a pretty solid overview as to what's happening with reverbs, and with analysis and capturing. And we're going to continue on. We're going to keep talking about reverb throughout for the rest of the semester, because that's part of that's one of the main characteristics when you're talking about a room. So other than that, that should be good for now. So cheers. Thanks for sticking around, and I will catch you all later. Cheers.